Real quick, I just wanted to forewarn listeners that I'm compiling this 2 years after they were originally recorded. So there has been a vast improvement, and I'm sorry for any rough spots these earlier ones have. So I hope you enjoy them as they come. Warning: this podcast frequently mentions violent acts and contains graphic content. Listener discretion advised. Now, get comfy and prepare yourself for another episode of The Nightmare Society. Growing up, I usually have weird experiences or unexplained events happen to me. A lot of these events I've pushed aside years after, not really thinking about what really happened. I'm usually skeptical to a lot of things, but I'd like to believe that there's something out there. Here's one of them that I can't really explain. I was about 16 in my junior year of high school when this happened. I lived in a small neighborhood among townhomes, and a block away from it was a park. It was a warm Friday in May, and I happened to be taking a short jog right after school at my usual route. There seemed to be no one else at the park that day. No younger kids, no usual baseball games going on. As I finished my jog, I made my way back to the entrance of the park. There happened to be a bench near the entrance, and sitting on the bench was an old African-American man wearing a tan trench coat and a flat cap reading the newspaper. He appeared to be in his 50s or 60s. Understanding that it was a hot day in the season, this confused me at the time. I was tired, and I decided to sit down and try starting a conversation with the man. Note, my town was fairly small in population, about 12,000, and so not a lot of crime happens, and when it does happen, it's usually underage kids drinking or petty crimes. So I wasn't really scared of the whole stranger situation. I struck up a conversation with the man. It was pretty normal as it gets. Beautiful day. Anything interesting in the papers? Yada yada yada. But then he asked me a peculiar question. He asked me, "Why are you at the park on such a rainy day?" Like I said, it was May at the time, and we haven't had rain in weeks. "What do you mean? It's lovely out." I chuckled. "If you say so," the man said as he continued to fuddle through the pages of the newspaper. I got up, said my goodbyes, and I remember walking towards the entrance. Now, here's the weird part. I remember waking up gasping for air on a patch of grass in the park, with rain heavily pouring down, my running clothes and shoes completely soaked in water. I get up slowly, trying to fathom what happened. I never fall asleep in the park, and I remember the exact time I went to the park, 3:30 p.m. I checked my phone, 4:30 p.m. Same date and everything. My jog is usually 45 minutes to an hour, so I would usually head back home right after. I ran back home, and when I arrived, I wrung out the water of my t-shirt and shorts. My parents came back home from work around an hour later. When they arrived, my dad asked, "How was your run? Beautiful day to go to the park." "Good, I guess, but it rained down," I hesitantly replied. "No," my dad chuckled. "It was sunny all day at work." My dad works in town, so I believe his statement was correct. I told my parents what happened, and they weren't really sure how to respond. We just continued the day normally right after. I texted my friends to ask what they think happened, and they didn't really have an answer either. In the end, I don't think the man did anything to me, and I don't think I fell asleep at the park at all. I just can't explain who that man is. Was he more than just human? Hey guys, quick reminder, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by leaving a review and sharing us with your friends. Thank you. The following is a true experience and happened to me over 5 months ago as of writing this. I'm still in debate what to think about the whole thing, so here goes. So I'm a teenager and was on camp in Wales with my school. We were camping in part of the Brecon Beacons National Park, which was full of pine trees and huge mountains. We arrived on a 3-hour coach drive where I sat next to this girl whose name isn't important as of now. Once we arrived, our first activity was putting up our tents. Luckily for my friends, I go camping all the time, so we put up the tent in about 15 minutes, much faster than the rest of the groups. We waited and talked about how surrounding the campsite was a train track which was in use, and miles of forest surrounding a huge reservoir that supposedly had the remains of an old village at the bottom. Once we had all finished putting up our tents, we crossed the road opposite the campsite and walked into a steep part of the pine forest. The trees were moderately thick with thin branches trailing upwards. This is kind of important for later. We started with some team building exercises like holding a rope so one of us could walk on it, etc. Me and my friend John noticed a deeply cut pentagonal shape carved into one of the bigger pines. This seemed like it had been recently carved and that it may have been part of a previous activity. We ignored this and continued to play the games that were set. I'll skip the rest of the story until the parts that are important. One of the evenings, me and my friends went back down to the forest by the reservoir to explore a little since we didn't have any activities set at the time. When we arrived in the forest, we talked and took some photos since the sun was just setting and the lighting was great. When we were reviewing the photos, we noticed another carving into one of the trees. This one was shaped like a cross, but had more patterns on it than I struggled to describe. The carving was about 1 inch deep and wasn't just carved with a knife. Tree sap was spilling out of it still, so it wasn't that old. We decided it was kind of strange and searched for more of them on the trees. When we regrouped, we had come back with photos of at least 7 more. Some were large and some were quite small, but nonetheless they were definitely creepy. They looked like the sort of thing that a cult would do, or a sort of ritual. We were freaked out, so we took some clearer photos and walked back to camp. Fast forward 2 days later when we had pretty much forgotten about the whole thing. We had a canoeing activity on the reservoir, and to get to the reservoir we had to go down through the forest. It's not like we were alone or anything since we were with adults and everyone else. We decided to check again just to be sure we hadn't missed any of them since it was dark out. And sure enough, there were more. However, the ones we had just found were, by the looks, brand new. Sap was just starting to come out of the cuts, and inside the tree was still freshly green. Freaked out, we took photos and wandered back to the groups as if we never left. After the day of canoeing, which was slightly brutal since we had to do activities whilst canoeing, we headed back up to camp to dry off and shower, etc. After I showered, I walked back up to our tent, which was right at the end of the long campsite. My friend, the girl who sat next to me on the coach. Lily joined me along the way since she had nothing else to do, and I told her about the carvings and the photos. And she told me that she was sitting with a bunch of the others and they saw at least 3 people wandering around the bank next to the campsite, which was divided by a fence and a train track. The 3 people, she presumed they were male, were dressed in black everything. She saw them and walked back to the group of people she was with. When they all walked back to see the men, they were gone. That, you might think, should be the end of the story. However, I can assure you it isn't. One night around 11 p.m., me and 2 of my friends who were sharing a tent with me were walking through the field towards our tent at the end, and we were passing the train tracks that run alongside the narrow field. A moment later, I heard something that resembled rocks falling down the bank onto the train tracks. We looked up to see nothing apart from trees tightly linked together. We looked at each other and then we heard more sounds. They were sounds of trees rustling and rocks tumbling down the bank. The sounds didn't sound intentional, as if by accident. But when rocks came rushing down the grass bank, colliding with the rocks on the train tracks at full force, we knew they were no longer accidental. All 3 of us practically sprinted along the field back to the dining hall where everyone was talking, playing cards, on their phones, etc. When we burst through the door, we told the camp leaders and anyone else that was listening openly about everything, and the leaders followed us outside to where we heard the noises. In fact, everyone came outside, which resulted in a mess of flashlight beams in the darkness. One of the leaders, named Sam, told us to turn our flashlights off, apart from the leader's flashlights and me and my friend's flashlights, so we could show where we saw the rocks. Eventually, we heard rustling up on the bank as if something was brushing through the trees. I shone my flashlight accordingly to where the sounds were coming from, and I really wish I hadn't. The white beam illuminated a black humanoid figure. It looked so impossibly tall, at least 7 feet tall, that I struggled to identify it. I stood frozen to the spot with the figure illuminated in my beam. However, it was facing away from me, its head pointing in the direction of the other kids. In fact, it was staring just to the edge of the crowd, where my best friend Lily stood, completely oblivious to the figure. It would be an understatement to say my heart leapt into my throat. The figure moved. It took a step forward, down the bank, then another. After this, everything happened in the heat of the moment, and it was all a blur of flashlights and shouting. I sprinted towards Lily, telling her to get back to the main building as fast as she could. Luckily, the leaders had seen the man when I did, and they shouted at the man to leave and that they're calling the police. The figure, now lit up completely by several beams of light, revealed an immensely tall, pale man, looking about 35 years old. He turned and sprinted back up the bank through the trees to whatever lay on the other side, mainly hills. I ran back to the main hall to find Lily sitting down in the dining room. She looked so visibly shaken up, and in truth, so was I. I sat and calmed her down, and after about a half an hour, she was okay. The rest of the camp was okay, but I could see that the incident had hurt the atmosphere. To this day, I still wonder what the man had wanted with her and what would have happened if I didn't intervene. This whole story is entirely true, and I'm also in Boy Scouts, and I have a lot more creepy stories from campouts I have been on with my group. Thanks for reading my story. I'm a bow hunter, and I still like to hunt, which is when you dress in full camo and walk through the woods rather than sit at a tree stand. Last October, I was coming down a hill into a marshy area. It was kinda late, and enough so that the side of the mountain was covered in shadows. I live in Pennsylvania, where our mountains are completely covered in trees and it gets dark fast. When I get to the bottom of the hill, I noticed that it was completely silent. No sounds at all, and I felt the hairs stand on my arms. But I've been creeped out before in the woods, so it wasn't too big of a deal. I kept on. I've been hunting in this general area before, but I've never gone down this hill. I continued creeping through the woods. Mind you, I am walking very slow, so you can barely hear my footsteps because deer are hard to sneak up on. And then I hear a voice call out for me from behind a thicket of small trees.
Help! John, come over here. I'm in trouble. Help!
And I swear to God it was my brother's voice. But my brother lives in Nevada, so it couldn't be my brother, and it said my name. It only took me a second to realize something wasn't right, and when I did, I ran faster than I ever have in my life. Only my dad knew where I was hunting that day, and the area is so huge no one would have found me there, and he's too old to have played any tricks on me. But something out there knew my name, and it sounded just like my brother. I don't know what the hell that was, but I don't think I'll ever be going back to the woods again. Maybe I'll move to the desert with my brother, where at least I can see everything around me. I was sitting on the couch watching Netflix when my dog, Reverend, a 90-pound pit lab shepherd mix, started growling at the window. I live in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, and have a large lake in front of my house, so there's a lot of wildlife, and I didn't think anything about it. I let Rev out, and he stayed on the porch and continued to pace and growl. After about 10 minutes, he scratched to be let back in. My couch is right next to the front door, so I just reached behind me and popped it open and didn't look. I heard him come in and go into the bedroom via hardwood floors, and I swung the door shut. Less than 3 minutes later, I hear Rev still growling on the porch. I got up and checked the bedroom, then the other rooms in the house. Nothing was in here. I let Reverend in and he hopped on the couch but was still growling. I had him get down and took him to check every room in the house, and he stayed a long time sniffing in the bedroom, but eventually came back in the living room and laid down like nothing ever happened. I didn't sleep well last night. What the heck came into my house? So I'm going to start off by telling you one of my experiences from my sister's house, as well as one of hers that scared me the most. Me and my fiance were about to stay at my sister's house for 2 to 3 nights to take care of the cats while she was away. We looked forward to it because she lives 5 minutes from the ocean and it's a really nice area. We got there in the morning and it was fine until the evening when we started feeling watched. We didn't tell each other that we felt uncomfortable though until after the whole experience. If I went to the bathroom upstairs while my fiance stayed in the kitchen, he told me he would turn to look behind his back all the time as it felt like someone stood there, while I hurried back from the bathroom as I felt the same way. So being alone for just a few minutes in the house made us feel really odd. Anyway, we stayed up and watched some movies and didn't notice anything weird. We went to bed and fell asleep. Then, it happened. My sister's bed is placed in the middle of the room. On one side of the bed, my side, there's this huge closet that has a big mirror on it. And on the other side, there's just a baby crib. And on the other side, there's just a baby crib. I woke up, facing towards the mirror, and I saw someone standing beside the bed. My first thought was that it was my fiance getting up to go to the bathroom or something. So I just closed my eyes again and asked him where he was going. Since he didn't reply, I turned around in bed and felt him pressed against me. He was still laying in bed with me after all. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow-like shape next to the bed for a few seconds. I felt really scared, but I didn't scream or anything. And I clearly felt that it was a man. When the shadow disappeared, I tried to wake up my fiance, but he was groggy and just laid his arms around me, and somehow I fell asleep as well. He was terrified when I told him about it in the morning, though. At first, I thought it was my mother, who passed away not long before this happened. But I could clearly feel that it was a man. And if it was my mother, would I feel scared and uncomfortable? The story my sister told me scares me the most. She had just taken a bath upstairs and was headed to bed. The bedroom is just beside the upstairs bathroom, when she heard that the TV was on downstairs. She went to check it out but saw someone laying in the couch in front of the TV, seemingly asleep. She thought it was her partner that had fallen asleep, so she went up to her bedroom again. But there he was. Her partner was asleep in the bed with their toddler. She woke him up and they went down to check it out, but there was no one there. The thing is that my sister has always had these stories, not just in this house. In one of her first apartments, she called my mom crying one night because she had laid in bed with her partner when someone walked up to her bed and sat down on her legs. She could clearly feel the weight of it and see the bed sheets move as if someone was sitting there. Other small things like hearing footsteps, seeing shadows, scratching on the bathroom door, etc., has always followed her. I know she played around a lot with the Ouija board when she was maybe 15 or 16. She's about 30 now. Has she just had bad luck finding a good home? Or is she followed? It creeps me out, but she doesn't like to talk about it and doesn't believe it herself. Just a reminder, guys, if you'd like to support the podcast, please leave a review and share us with your friends. Thank you. My parents had divorced when I was really young, around 5 or 6 years old. However, my parents were on mostly good terms, so they settled for joint custody. For those of you who don't know what that is, basically I would travel back and forth between my mom and dad's house every other week. Around 8 years after the divorce, my dad met who is now my stepmother. She was a few years older than him and financially stable, having a government job, something to do with the housing authority. I don't know the details of what she does, but she had a son that was a couple of years older than me. She and my dad had pretty okay credit, so they bought a large 2-story house in a mill town in Louisiana for practically a steal. They could almost buy it up front, and having opened our own gas station, money was rolling in. It was currently my mother's rotation, so I didn't get to see the house until a week later. When I did come to the new house, I found that they had already set up my bedroom in one of the 2 bedrooms upstairs. They were both built really simply. To paint a mental picture of them, the stairs basically led up to a small hallway with a linen closet to the wall on your left, my stepbrother's bedroom on the right, and my bedroom a short walk down the hall to the left. Each room had a walk-in area with another door that led into a bathroom which could be used to travel between the two rooms, which I found to be an odd design choice, even at my young age of 13. The first night I had stayed in the house, me and my stepbrother Dylan were upstairs. I distinctly remember we were playing Ratchet and Clank, going commando split screen on the PlayStation 2. We were both sitting on the floor with our backs against the door when we heard and felt 3 distinct knocks on the door against our backs. We both looked at each other. We hadn't heard anyone come up the stairs, so we asked who it was. No reply. Just silence. So he got up and opened the door to find, you guessed it, no one was there. We had shrugged it off, but I did tell our parents, who told us not to worry. We had shrugged it off, but did tell our parents, who told us not to worry. I had stayed in the room for several months in weekly rotations. One night, however, I woke up extremely hot. I don't know what time it was, but it couldn't have been too late because I heard my stepmom and her friend Jan talking downstairs. I should mention that at that age I slept with my door cracked and the hallway light on outside. When I woke up, my room was pitch black and my fan was off. To make matters worse, the hallway light was off, but my door was still open. Hearing my stepmom downstairs, I decided that I would go downstairs to see what they were doing and to pee downstairs. While there was a bathroom upstairs, the toilet unfortunately didn't work correctly. Something about the plumbing was messed up. However, as I got up and started to cross the room, the door gently swayed to the latch of my door, then slammed shut. I had never been so scared in my life. I don't know how long I stood there frozen in fear, but it felt like hours. Nothing happened as I stood there, so finally I mustered up the courage to open the door to find nothing there. Spooked, I rushed down the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet. I joined my stepmom and her friend downstairs, who promptly yelled at me for still being up on a school night. I had noticed that they were both sitting around the coffee table on the floor. On the table is what I realized later in my life was a Ouija board. I stopped staying in that bedroom after that. Update. My stepmom and dad have both moved out of the house since then, but just last night I was having a beer with my dad and I had asked him about the house and if anything strange had ever happened to him while he and my stepmom were there. After the events of the Ouija board, strange stuff had started happening around the house. Pictures and crucifixes especially would randomly fall off the walls. In some cases, they would come home from working at the store and every wall decoration would be on the ground. In other cases, items would randomly disappear. Most frustratingly, my dad's keys, which included his truck keys and a multitude of keys for the store, storage, door keys, etc. They would eventually turn up, but always in the most bizarre places like the back of the bathroom cabinet or in the kitchen sink. In some of the weeks that I wasn't there, they say they would hear a drum, but could never find the source of the noise. My dad would always follow the sound to one room, only for it to start up somewhere else in the house. Another time, all 3 of them were in the den watching a movie when there was a loud bang coming from the master bedroom. My dad says it sounded exactly like a gunshot. Rushing into the bedroom, he found nothing but a black stain on the wall that was roughly the circumference of a quarter. Supposedly, they scrubbed and scrubbed at it, but it wouldn't come off the wall, so they eventually covered it up with a picture. The last experience they had was by far the scariest. Supposedly, one night my dad had gotten out of bed, presumably to use the bathroom, but instead of going to the master bathroom, he went to the little closet bathroom that was located under the stairs. My stepmom tells me that she awoke to banging outside of their room. She quickly realized my dad wasn't in bed. According to her, she heard him banging around and yelling from inside the bathroom.
Help me.
She tried to open the door, and despite the handle turning, she couldn't open the door. Finally, after 10 minutes, she had forced the door open to find him in the dark, covered in his own urine and crying. I should mention that my father is hard as nails and is not one to cry. He claims he doesn't remember getting up or going to the bathroom at all. He also won't tell us what it was that he saw in there. It was only a few months later that they moved out and put the house up for sale. My dad didn't even go back to sign the paperwork. Whatever he saw shook him to the core. This started in April of this year and is somewhat still going on. My husband and I bought a cabin on 7 acres of land. It's part woods, but the majority is open fields that's partially fenced. There's a tree line that separates one side of my land from a neighboring farm. That tree line is a nice view out my kitchen window and is quite pretty. But now it terrifies me. Around the end of April, I am walking my land, just exploring as we had just moved in. I happen to glance up and I see an unoccupied tree stand. I didn't think much of it since we live in the country and the land is full of deer and turkey. It was not hunting season, but people still like to watch the wildlife. The only off thing about it was that it faced my house. I went on with my day, not thinking about it. About 2 days later, I'm pulling in my driveway and happen to look across my field and I see the damn tree stand in a freaking different tree and still facing my house. It creeped me out, but I didn't feel threatened because there's 1.5 acres between my house and the tree stand. I had never seen a person in the stand, and my husband told me it's probably someone deer or bird watching, which made me feel better. The tree stand ended up moving from tree to tree so much that it became a game between my daughter and I to play Find the Tree Stand until late June. It was almost dark outside when I took our puppy out to potty. As he's doing his business, I mosey on over towards the tree line, not even thinking about the tree stand. I tend to wander around our property just enjoying the peacefulness and animal noises. I'm not good with determining distance, but I guess I was about 25 feet from the tree line when I see him. A man with what looked like either a camera or binoculars around his neck. I couldn't make out many details because it was almost dark. I truly don't believe he knew that I saw him because I didn't react to him. I was walking diagonally toward the tree line and could see him out of my right peripheral vision. I pretend like I don't see him and mosey my way back toward my house when I hear a creak of the tree stand and him scurrying down the damn tree. He had to make it down the stand, which gave me a head start, but he was frantically making his way out of the tree. I looked back one time and saw him at the edge of a cattle fence looking at me. My husband searched the property line for him but didn't find him. My daughter no longer stays at home alone and I carry my pistol every time I go outside. I hate having to carry a weapon on my own property. I feel as though I'm being watched and it's not a good feeling. We still see the tree stand and it's moved from tree to tree. Sometimes we can't spot it at all, which creeps me out even more. I probably should have originally mentioned that the tree stand has not been on my side of the property. It's always been on the tree line and the neighbor owns the tree line. They planted trees and let the brush grow up as a way to divide the land. There's also a cattle fence along the tree line. In response to some comments on the post, the contributor mentions that they don't have many neighbors, but the ones they do have know about this, but they have no idea who he could be. The only neighbor they haven't spoken to about it is the one that owns the property that the tree stand is on. The lady owns over 100 acres and is elderly, and the poster hears from neighbors that she lives alone. They've thought about knocking on her door and asking if she knows who it could be, but they don't want to freak her out. This story began in March of 2017. I'm a 19-year-old male. My family and I moved to this new house in March of 2017. I was really excited because this house was huge and had a beautiful garden with a pool and a hot tub. I'm not bragging, but this information will be important later on. When we moved in, the real estate agent told my parents and me that there had been a series of home invasions on our street and that the house and our neighbor's house were the only ones which they haven't broken in yet. The first weird things started happening in May of 2017. My room is at the patio, so when I look out my window, I can see the patio and the hot tub. At first, I could hear the gate of our garden being opened at night. That was continuing for the next 10 weeks. Sometimes we would go outside in the morning and all the lamps would be bashed in. Yes, 10 weeks. It's like the property is haunted by a poltergeist since we haven't seen anybody doing these things. At first, we thought that some burglars are opening our garden gate at night because every morning my parents open the patio door so our dog can go outside and pee while one of my parents would get dressed to go for a morning walk. So I guess the burglars were hoping for our dog to run off so they would have it easy to enter our home. All these incidents made me and my mom feel really unsafe in our own house. All of a sudden it stopped, so we thought that the person or people whoever did this moved on or got bored. But after 5 months, everything started over again, but worse. In November, I woke up to footsteps outside my window, so I opened my eyes and wished that I wouldn't have done that. The moment I was so scared of actually happened. What I saw was a 6'3" man standing outside my window and watching me while I sleep. He looked so old yet so young. He had this young face, but his haircut made him look 25 years older. At least that's what I could see in the dark. I was frozen. I couldn't move, so we just looked at each other in the eyes for what felt like an eternity. Suddenly he ran off, so I took my chance and ran to my parents' room and told them everything. My dad grabbed his gun, which he is keeping at home now because he got worried over the past months. He's a police officer. He ran outside but couldn't find the man, but only a broken gate, so he called the police. The police, actually 2 colleagues of his, came, but they couldn't do much, so they left rather quickly. 2 months later, I woke up to splashing sounds. I got up and looked outside my window. I noticed that the sound was coming from the pool, but I couldn't see it due to trees blocking my view. So I shrugged it off because I thought that there's just something wrong with the pump, which wasn't a rare thing. So I went back to bed. I had a hard time falling asleep though, since the sound grew louder and more intense. So I got up and went to the living room, which allows me to see the entire garden. When I looked outside, I got the same feeling which I had 2 months ago when I spotted the guy outside my window. Anyway, I looked outside and saw the same man standing in our pool, draining our pool with a small cup. And I mean it how I said it. He was standing in our pool with a cup, throwing the pool water on the grass. He had this dead stare in his eyes like he didn't even know what he was doing. He noticed me watching him and just smiled at me while diving down like that's his way to escape. I woke up my dad, who immediately called the police. They left as fast as they came since they didn't find anything but an empty pool. They said he was probably homeless and was just washing himself, but I'm certain he was not just washing himself. It is now August of 2018. I noticed some weird cars standing in front of our house lately, and if someone would spot them, they would drive off. My parents left me alone this weekend since it's my uncle's birthday. I didn't want to come along, so I decided to stay home. I got bored all alone at this big house, so I called a couple of friends of mine to come and hang out at my place. They came around 7 p.m. and we started drinking some wine and listening to some music. Time passed and it was 11 p.m. when we heard someone knocking at the window of our living room. I thought I was imagining the knocks, but my friends looked at me like they were about to ask if I was expecting someone else. I turned off the music to listen, but all we heard was silence. I turned on the patio lights when a girlfriend of mine yelled, "Hey, there's someone running!" I didn't see anyone, but heard the gate slam shut. I was worried, but decided not to call the police since they couldn't do anything anyway. I was really glad that my friends drank something and had to crash at my place so I wouldn't be alone that night. Today is Saturday and my friends left around 5 p.m. I was in my room when I heard something fall in my bathroom, so I got up to see what it was. When I walked towards the bathroom, I was dying inside when I could see a person right behind the door. The person didn't notice that I spotted him, so I walked back in my room to get my phone to call the police and my parents. I wanted to go down to the den because my lock on my door was broken. When I passed the bathroom, I saw that the person was still there, so I opened my camera and took a picture as proof for my family and friends. Here is the photo. It's not a very interesting photo. I zoomed in a little. When I took the photo, my dumbass didn't think about the flash, so when I took the pic, the light illuminated the entire bathroom and the door slammed shut. I thought that was my chance to abandon the house completely, so I ran right out of my house and called the police. They arrived within 10 minutes. They went inside and came out with the same man who was terrorizing me and my family for over a year now, half naked. The police said he was sitting in our bathtub just staring at the drain. He was constantly saying,
"The cult elderly will eliminate you. The cult elderly will eliminate you. The cult elderly will eliminate you. The cult elderly."
Right now, I am sitting here in my room writing this story and worrying about the cult he was talking about. Are the suspicious cars in front of my house part of the cult, or was he just an insane man? This entire event doesn't make sense to me, and I don't know what is yet to come, but my family and I will move again in December. Thank God. Thank God.
The cult elderly.
I was camping in a campground in North Georgia with some friends. It was starting to downpour, so everyone left their tents in the woods and decided to rent out one of the on-site cabins for everyone to sleep in. I decided I'd sleep in my car because they wanted to stay up late and I was tired from kayaking all day. I woke up to the rain stopping and it was kind of cold in the car, and I had forgotten my sleeping bag in my tent. I checked the cabin to see if there was any room left, and the light was on and everyone was fast asleep. It was 3 a.m. I didn't want to squeeze in, so I decided to trek my way back to the tent in the dark with a small pen light. In order to get to my tent, I had to pass by everyone's that they left. Mine was the last one, and even then it was 50 feet at least from the previous tent before it. I got in my tent, covered up with my sleeping bag, and prepared to catch the last few hours of sleep before sunrise. No more than 10 or 15 minutes from me getting in my tent, I began to hear a light whisper right outside the tent door. It wasn't in English, and to my recollection, it was indecipherable, as in not in any language I had heard at all. Just as the voices started, two orbs appeared together outside the tent. They weren't the same glare as a flashlight would make, and both were of two different colors that, to the best of my ability, had no real distinct color. Just colorful. The whispers outside the tent began arguing louder between each other, but still in a hushed tone. And as the whispers grew louder, the lights began swirling around the tent. Behind me, to the side, to the front. Not in the movement that one could make with flashlights, and at this point I realized no footsteps could be heard. I uncovered myself and knelt on the tent floor, preparing for the zipper to come undone like in a horror movie, and I was flipping through my mind on what option to take. I was the most terrified I had ever been. Fight or flight. The lights swirled faster and the voices grew louder, but still breathy and whispery. My mind raced and I was sweating despite the cold. And then, just like that, the lights shut off like a light switch, and the whispers stopped, and nothing but silence of an empty wood. I stood there as still as I could, and I didn't dare go outside that tent until the sun came up. It was, and still is, the scariest moment of my life. I hope this makes sense. I've never written it out before. Interestingly enough, I went to a horror movie premiere recently, and there was a scene that had the voices in it, and goosebumps ran right up my arm. It was identical. The movie is called Beacon Point. There's a specific scene. It brought back the memory and sent chills up my back like I was reliving it. Keep in mind, the movie is not particularly good. Somewhere along the lines of a sci-fi original, but funny enough, after I had to talk to the director or writer. So I found him, and I asked him where he got the idea for the noises for the aliens. He told me that him and his wife camped in the North Georgia mountains, and he had an experience similar to mine with voices, and he told me that's what inspired him to make the movie. No joke. He was busy chatting with others, and immediately he stopped and said, "We're going next door for a drink together. Let's talk." The contributor, nerdybynature, answered a question further down the post, stating, "It was a floating globe of light. Each was a different color, but I couldn't really tell the other color per se. It was like they were all colors at once, but each had a distinctive trait to discern from each other. They glided, or floated, I guess, swirling over each other. You know how when you see someone walking with a flashlight in the dark coming towards you? It's kind of shaky and it has a center to the light and sort of blooms out. It wasn't anything like that. They were very controlled movements, and the light itself was solid and fluid. They circled the tent over each other, around and round. They sped up faster, and the whispering sounds grew louder as they did." Further down, someone commented finding the movie on YouTube, asking for a timestamp. nerdybynature listed the timestamp as to the voices he was talking about. Here's a quick clip.
Drink?
My junior year in college, I had a strange experience. First, a few details. My dorm room was attached to my roommate's, so that I had to go out to hers to get to the bathroom or the hallway. She was a light sleeper, but I wasn't the type to be out late, so it didn't really matter. I had 2 normal operations in my life at that time, and discovered that while under anesthesia, I would wake up briefly toward the end, before I was supposed to. If I get a mosquito bite, I gotta deal with it for at least a month. I'm not a fast healer. One night I had the most vivid dream of my life. I woke up briefly somewhere else and then I went right back to sleep. In this dream, I looked left, I looked right, and then passed back out, just like if I was in surgery. I was on a hospital gurney, slightly inclined, facing the wall. There was ambient noise behind me, and the echoes suggested it was a very large room. There was nothing sinister about the noises. On either side of me was a row of empty hospital gurneys. At my feet, just to my right, two people were having a conversation sitting on a bench against the wall. One was a person in a dark suit. The other was... I don't know what it was. It was small, and I saw its hands, which appeared to have darker skin, grayish. They were speaking together, so animated and excited, like two old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. And they didn't notice me wake up. I didn't recognize the dialogue, though I don't speak German, Mandarin, Russian, etc. I recognize them when I hear them. This language was wholly unrecognizable, yet the person in the suit was fluent. I went back to sleep. In the morning, I said, "Self, that was a messed up dream," and then went to the shower. As I passed my roommate, who was still in bed, she asked, "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was odd. After my shower, I started to put my makeup on and noticed something on my face. I leaned closer and could not believe what I saw. Two perfectly parallel lines, impossibly thin, impossibly perfect. There was some clear, hard gel on top, and that's what I felt. There was no blood. My own hair was thicker than the width of the cuts, yet I could see down into my skin a little ways. This was 1996. I had never seen anything like this. These days, I would say it was a laser cut topped with a liquid band-aid, but neither of those things seemed to be prevalent in those days. I said, "Okay, there's an explanation." I slept on a staple or a paperclip. I do homework in my bed all the time. I went and scoured my pillow for anything sharp and found nothing. So I got my sewing needle, a staple from some homework, and a paperclip. I dunked them in hydrogen peroxide and made cuts on my face similar to what was there. Immediately blood welled up and the skin was jagged for all three objects, and the width of all the cuts were thicker than the laser cuts. I determined that nothing in my room could have made the cuts. I didn't have an X-Acto knife, but I knew the blood would well up the same way if I did. I skipped my first class as I tried to figure out what to do. I kept obsessively feeling my face all day, in awe of the perfection of what was there and how it could have come to be there. There were only two people on campus rich enough to have a new digital camera, which meant I would have to borrow a friend's 35mm because I didn't have my own. That meant I would have to explain myself to my friend and possibly the Photoshop when the pictures came back. Who would I even give the photos to? Who would I even contact, and what would I tell them? In those days, if you even said the word alien, you were a pariah. After hours of mental debate sitting on the edge of my bed, I gave up thinking about it and finished my classes for the day. I sat on the edge of my bed into the night, debating, unsure of what to do. In the wee hours of the morning, I woke up. The cuts were gone, completely healed, no trace of even a scar. I was disturbed for a few days, but then I eventually forgot about it. A few years after graduating, I decided I was going to have some dental work done, and I went to 2 different offices to get quotes. They both took a full facial x-ray. I had long since forgotten about my crazy dream and the cuts until I sat down across from the x-ray technician and pointed to a strange thing showing up above my teeth. I asked if I was looking at a mirror image because it was on the same side as my cuts had been, rather than the opposite side. No, I was told the x-ray was an actual, not a mirror image, so the right side of the image corresponded with the right side of my face. I pointed to the almost square image above my teeth and asked what that was. "It's just an x-ray anomaly," he said. He didn't seem bothered by it. I figured that meant that there was some damage or irregularity with the x-ray plates and let it go. Then I went to the second dentist, an orthodontist actually, and had gotten another x-ray done. You guessed it. The square was there in the exact same place. This time I didn't even try to make polite small talk or beat around the bush. I pointed to the square and said, "What is that?" This time the tech looked at me funny and said, "It's an x-ray anomaly." Then she leaned closer to me and whispered, "We see them all the time," in a way that gave me goosebumps. This was in Spokane, Washington. I didn't know what else to say, so I said nothing. Could it be that whatever negatives or plates or whatever they use for an x-ray were damaged in exactly the same spot in exactly the same shape? Maybe, I guess. I don't know much about x-rays. After that, I reflected on my situation. I don't feel freaked out, but I think there might be something in my face put there by somebody else. Here's what I know. We do this all the time to other species. We chase them with helicopters, shoot at them with tranquilizer darts, take rectal temperature, take blood samples, stamp radio tags in their ears with no regard to if it hurts or the trauma of the event, or if their furry buddies will ostracize them later because they have something funky on their ear. In my situation, I was clearly well cared for, if it really happened at all. Someone was there as some kind of representative on my behalf. I was handled in such a way that if I didn't have a weird metabolism, I wouldn't have known what even happened. I never once felt pain. My cut healed instantly. If this is some kind of research-driven radio tag for the purposes of data collection, preservation of habitat or species like we would do, they did it with far more regard for me than we would have for other species on our own planet. I don't know what might happen if I get another x-ray 20 years later. I've tried to look when I go through airport security if anything shows up on the image we see in the booth, but I don't see anything. Strangely, I'm okay with this. I think it might just be science, nothing nefarious or evil. I wish my consent had been asked first, but I suppose it's hard to ask for consent when you're not even supposed to exist. This happened to my father. I've been a long-time lurker here, so I thought I'd finally share a retelling of his story. My dad was born in the early 70s. My grandfather, an environmental scientist, worked for a state college who had a research facility in Mission, Texas, so they relocated there when my dad was just a few months old. One night, my grandparents were at a banquet for the college. They hired a babysitter to watch my dad while they were at this party. At this point, he was still very much an infant, so her duties were really just to feed and change him and make sure he was good while he slept. My dad had his own room and a crib, so after he was put down for the night, the babysitter would periodically come back into the room to check on him. She did this several times throughout the evening, him always being in his crib, asleep. Around 8 p.m., just a few hours or so before my grandparents were due to come home, she went into the room to check on him and discovered he was missing. Now, keep in mind, he was less than 6 months old at the time, so getting himself out of the crib was next to impossible. She frantically turns on the lights and starts searching the room. Nothing. She goes into every single room in the house and searches. He's nowhere to be seen. Around 9 p.m., after an hour of searching the house, she decides to call the school to get a hold of my grandparents. After receiving the message, they obviously freak out and rush home. When they get there, they find the babysitter sobbing, pleading that she had searched everywhere and couldn't find my dad. Together, they all began searching the house. Still no signs of the baby. Around 10 p.m., they call the police. They arrive rather quickly and start searching the home, as well as interviewing the babysitter and my grandparents. They search every room, the garage, the attic. Then they move their search to the surrounding outdoor areas, looking for forced entry, tracks, anything. At this point, my dad has been missing for close to 4 hours. The police didn't find any evidence of forced entry, nothing out of the ordinary in and around the home. The police decide that they need to gather photos and start a town-wide search. My grandparents, frantic, provide photos and a description. The babysitter stayed the whole time, crying and apologizing, adamantly giving the same statement over and over again. While my grandparents, the head police officer, and the babysitter are exchanging the photographs and going over the next steps of the search, some other police officers are given the order to do a final sweep of the house around 1 a.m. When they go into my father's room, they find him asleep in his bed. They never found out what happened. The police, mega confused, ended up just leaving, and my grandparents sent the babysitter home. Eventually, everyone just forgot about it and things went back to normal. To this day, my dad claims he has a knot in his neck that he's had ever since he can remember. He says it seems like a foreign object, but he's too scared to go get it checked out. I ask him about it sometimes, and he kinda just laughs and shrugs it off.